And now we need to move on to the panel. So stay where you are, Peter, because you'll be our second speaker on the panel. So if I can just make sure that Mike has prepped all the other panel members. So the panel are going to discuss a question. So the question is, what does the future of education for peace look like? So to start off with, thank you very much, Shonagh.
Hello, everyone. Hope you have had a wonderful day. Really interesting conference, and it's been a joy to listen to everybody. I won't talk for 5 minutes, but I have a few kind of things for us to ponder on, really. I think it's a real challenge, or it might be a challenge for some of us, especially young people, to visualise what peace might look like and how we achieve that in a time when conflict seems to feature so largely in the world today. I'm talking to you from the UK, and even within the UK, there's much in the way of conflict. When we look at, you know, the issues with Northern Ireland at the moment, and the border, and the discussions that we're having with the EU. I think people would prefer we use the word discussion rather than conflict, but you know, people don't agree, and by definition that is a conflict of ideas, at least. We've also got in Europe a real attention draw in the shape of Ukraine and what that means, and the questions that brings up for our young people. It certainly brings up questions for my children around the kitchen table. We can see disruption and war in Afghanistan, in Syria, and we also have questions around our kitchen table about the way those things are presented, how refugees and conflict and wars presented in Ukraine, and how that is presented in the rest of the world, and even a conflict around how we present those ideas and how we present those similar circumstances in very different ways. And then we can see, looking across to our neighbours across the water to America, and the disagreement around gun laws. So I think there's a lot that would catch the attention of young people today, and perhaps they might feel there isn't a great deal of peace in the world, and maybe they also reflect on their own circumstances at home, and maybe they also reflect on, you know, the impact of social media and the internal conflicts they might feel there. So I think the future of peace really is in the hands of the next generation. I feel like I don't feel particularly old, but that even my generation has messed it up already. And you know, I think actually that it's in the hands of the next generation to deal with it. And I think our responsibility now is, how do we facilitate young people to lead in creating a peaceful world? How do we facilitate that? What do we need to do as adults to provide young people with the skills and the tools? How do we create future leaders to do a better job than we've done? How do we develop a sense of curiosity in young people, rather than, you know, becoming a really polarized and doubling down world? How do we create curiosity and generate conversation and a wanting to learn from other people, to understand, and that listening to understand? How do we implement equity, diversity and inclusion strategies in our schools? That's something that I do regularly, but how do we make sure that that is a long-term thing, that is meaningful, that has impact, and that you can measure progress? And how do we make sure that actually happens? And then finally, how do we draw their attention to work for social justice across, you know, all areas of life, all types of people? So I guess I haven't spoken, but asked a lot of questions, really. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Shonagh. They're very pertinent questions and things that we all need to consider. So thank you very much. So handing over now to Peter.
Thank you. And thank you for your question, Chandra. You know, a couple things about the United States. One is we try to express knowledge in bumper stickers. And there was a popular bumper sticker, if you want peace, work for justice. And I think that a lot of the educational work that we're trying to do is to encourage young people to think about justice. and to think about the fundamental inequities that, well, I used to say, or I still say, that Karl Marx's theory of history, in a nutshell, this could also be a bumper sticker, is that history deals you a hand of cards. You decide how to play them. I think education is in part about making sure that young people get cards that actually have truth in them. And we're in quite a battle in the United States about curriculum, the push against so-called critical race theory. This past week, I was able to lead a conversation about the remarkable book put together by Nikole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times called The 1619 Project, to really engage with people and ask them, as Nikole Hannah-Jones puts it, what is your origin story? What do you think the beginnings of the United States are? And what is the consequences and legacy of those origins? And so we're trying to make sure that kids get access to accurate information about the expropriation of indigenous people, about the transatlantic slave trade, about the exploitation of immigrants. Our friend Erica Lee at the University of Minnesota has recently published a book called America for Americans, a history of xenophobia. So we're trying to present that information, and then we're trying to find learning strategies, pedagogical strategies that enable kids to take ownership. So I'll tell one hopefully quick story and get out of the way. And there is a program in the United States called National History Day, and hundreds of thousands of middle school and high school students engage in research projects around a theme. And we see a lot of those kids at the Eastside Freedom Library and help them with directing them to resources and engaging them in conversations. 2 years ago, the theme was called Breaking Barriers. And we had 3 young women come to the library, 7th graders, who were interested in telling the story of an African-American woman journalist named Ethel Payne. And Ethel Payne went from the Chicago Defender in the 1950s, where she had covered the funeral of Emmett Till, to becoming the first Black woman in the White House press corps. And when she hit Washington in 1955, she confronted President Eisenhower about the construction of the interstate highway system and why was there no regulation against Jim Crow segregation on the new federal highway system that was being built. And these kids completely fell in love with Ethel Payne. And she was someone, I have to admit, I had not heard of until these 3 young women came into the library. And together we found resources about her. But we also found in her a role model for these kids, how they could be active in any field of endeavor on behalf of justice. And they were telling the story of this role model. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm optimistic, even though the United States is a mess. But every day my interaction with young people makes me optimistic. Thank you.
Delighted to hear that, Peter, and thank you very much.
Very much, Helen. Thank you also, Shonagh, for your very wise prompts. And Peter, yes, for some very, very interesting insight, which I think has been really, really valuable. I've reflected, I think, for a very long time on the future of education, particularly in organizations that consider themselves to be future-facing. but which live with a history or a legacy of innate and systemic prejudices and inequalities. And I think the question throws up the whole idea, the question about the future of education throws up, I think, implicitly, the whole notion of leadership, which in turn, I think, branches out probably to the question of the will to change, the will to improve the world, a clarity of vision. But then I think we're always butting heads with kind of the meta world. And I think we still live in a world where in our minds things are polarized. In our minds things, we major on difference. We look at the world in a bipartisan, binary kind of way. And I think that one of the things that I'm beginning to think more and more is about the reality of the VUCA world. I think it was a term, Peter, you'll be able to correct me on this, but I think it was a term first used in 1992 by the American Air Force when they were working on their military sort of policies to go into countries, particularly in the Middle East, when they were working out their foreign policy. And I think that they realized then, that we were going into a world that was becoming increasingly fragmented. So a world that was volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So I think that, because we live in a world that is becoming increasingly fragmented, it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to hold all the divergent parts together. So how does one do that? How does one bring together, a world where people are always othering other people? And I think that, one of the ways in which to do that is to recognize that when someone is in conflict with another person, I'm not a psychologist, disclaimer, that when someone is in conflict with someone else, there is an unheard or an unacknowledged need at the center of it. And I think if we can unify around getting as many people's voices heard and their needs responded to, then that is perhaps the beginning of the compassion education that we are working towards, that the International Baccalaureate aspires to, that Kurt Hahn constructed in his imagination in the backdrop to programs like the International Baccalaureate. And there are really simple ways to do this. Peter, I come back to your point, narratology and the whole idea of narrative and storytelling is so innate and so natural to human beings that to simply bring people together and to hear their stories is just one of the multifarious ways that we can proceed to make people feel that their needs are acknowledged, that they are being heard, and where we can lead in a way that is specific to what and is authentic. And I think that when people feel authenticity, they respond in a like manner. So those are my opening thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shamiela. That was really fascinating and insightful. Thank you. Molly, are you ready to speak now? And can I just introduce Molly Matlotio, who is an SDG 4, 5 and 10 practitioner and an ESL master trainer at Rhodes University in Johannesburg. Thank you, Molly.
So my thoughts around this whole thing. Okay, so in South Africa, we have a tricky history that everybody knows about with apartheid and all of that. But what also happened in that history is that we were othered, the whole point was to divide and conquer, right? And not only within South Africa, but across the continent. So when other countries were getting their independence and things were off to a shaky start and things like that, the narrative was constantly, do you want to look like them? See what happens. So almost the scaring of people to say, unless you are controlled and managed in this way, things are going to be that bad, right? And so as a result, South Africans don't really know what other Africans know about the rest of the continent. we exist in this little bubble where we very much think we're doing so much better down here than everywhere else on the continent because, you know, of that narrative that no, independence for Africans is not good. And as a result, we've had a lot of xenophobic attitudes and even attacks happening on the continent. And because of that, it's been so bad that when we do engage with others and when others do come to the continent, I mean, to the country from the rest of the continent, it's bad. It is bad because we don't know of the other. And there's this insane otherness that we Africans treat towards other Africans. And so because of that and all of that xenophobic thingy, we've started, I'm in materials development. So what we do is develop materials learning. And I've been very deliberate about including stories from the rest of the continent in our storytelling, in the stories that we use, be it in textbooks or be it whatever, using names, something simple as a name, and then maybe later referring to what that name means, or when some character is being true to their name, or little phrases that kids it's a word asking for help, 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 or in another language from the rest of the continent. Or if it's saying, oh, a thief, a thief. I remember the one story was saying, wheezy, wheezy, or a word like that. And it's a word for thief in Swahili. So those are small ways in which, you know, you're trying to sort of bridge that gap between the otherness that has been created because there is very little education in what I think needs to go towards, you know, peace on the continent. But their efforts. But anyway, this is just my little corner of that and what we do in the spaces that I'm in. And yeah, hopefully there'll be other bigger strides, but we're starting somewhere. We will go somewhere. And that's what Molly does in her little corner.
Thank you very much, Molly. That was really wonderful to have a really different perspective. So thank you very much indeed. And we'll finish off the introductory points with Anne and Beatty, who is the National Coordinator for the UNESCO ASPnet UK. Thank you, Anne.
Wow, what a day it's been today. Well, I think that today has really shown what wonderful work in education is taking place already. I have really loved how people have been sharing and connecting today. And I'm just going to talk very briefly on a couple of the themes that have come up for me, which are curriculum development. I think we need to get more creative and ensure everyone has the opportunity that they need for them. And I think how we develop ourselves as educators in terms of reflecting on our own personal biases and stereotypes is key when we're looking at that. Shonagh suggested earlier that we should visit our curriculums and ask ourselves, what diet are our young people getting in a cumulative sense? And I think we should all be reflecting on the words we use, the stereotypes that are in our heads, because we've all got them. And I think that's really important that we do that. And one of the ways that we do that is by listening to others, sharing our stories, encouraging other people and giving them the safe space to share their stories. I think that's been, you know, particularly for young people. They often think that their voices are not heard. Many of the conversations I have with young people is that, you know, why do I need to learn about history? It's irrelevant to me. Why, you know, should I join the conversation? Because nobody listens. And I think we need to change that. Marcelo shared with us the idea that we need school leadership that equips all children to thrive emotionally, socially, culturally, and academically. Because I think in many of our curriculums, the focus is on the academic and testing children. And that leads, as we all know, to massive mental health problems. And I think, you know, that is something that we should look at. And just finally, I would like to say that I think I would really hope that, well, I'll use your word, Peter. I am optimistic that everybody here today will work together on the UNESCO ASPnet Arts and Culture for Peace initiative, which we launched this morning. And also, I think we will work in many other ways. I think we are all connected, and we need to remember that today more than ever. And I think I shall leave it there.
Very much, Anne. That's brilliant. Thank you. It's good to hear about people being optimistic. So now I'm going to start with the questions, but do feel anybody that you can put questions into the chat as well. But I have a few questions which have already been submitted. So I'm going to start with this question. What steps have you taken recently to promote international mindedness? So I'm going to start with Shamiela. Shamiela, would you like to answer that question first, please?
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think one of the natural advantages of doing a program like the International Baccalaureate, but not, of course, exclusive to the International Baccalaureate, is that by following that program, one of necessity has a second language. Okay, so if one is fortunate enough, I think, to work in a school where there is space to have that discussion about empowering students through a second language, that's great, that's fantastic. But we have also very recently developed a language policy where we are very, very clear about the use of language within the college and within the curriculum, but then also around and outside the curriculum. So, for example, students are given the opportunity to do a modern foreign language within the curriculum, sometimes too. That's great, that's wonderful. That's our academic diet. Outside, however, we've taken great strides, particularly with our international students, to get them to speak in their mother tongue, to encourage them to not end up with a kind of deficit bilingualism. Because I think in a colonized world, we all live with a world with the supremacy of English, where people learn English and follow their studies and find themselves in academic contexts where English is prioritized at the cost to the mother tongue. So that's something that we've met head on. But there is, and I think that for Molly, this will be particularly fascinating, coming from a country where there are, 16, I think, national languages, Molly? Yeah, and actually 11, gosh, I should know that, I'm embarrassed. Anyway, but then we also have worked very hard on student leadership. And this is something that I think is a piece of work that's never done, where the students have put together a document about what is acceptable language for them in their time and what isn't. So the students have been brilliant in really meeting challenges, in talking about why for them certain language constitutes a slur, and other people have, used their right of reply, why for other people that is not the case. And that is, as I say, in this very complex world that we're all living in, we're never going to settle on a point. What is important is the dialogue. So I think, that's one of the ways in which we have promoted international mindedness. We are very keen, of course, to celebrate festivals, to celebrate people's heritage, so we run 2 calendars. We run the academic calendar, and at the same time, we run the United Nations calendar in our school, so that certain days are highlighted right from the outset and certain days are celebrated. Next week, for example, we are holding Diversity Week. Okay, we participate in all kinds of fora as a school to bring people in to educate ourselves. There is this, I think we are what Peter Senge referred to as a learning organization way back in the 90s, that we are constantly engaged in the process of educating ourselves. And one of the ways we do that, and I'd love to invite all of you to this, is the Leadership College that we run here at Hockerell, where we actually focus specifically on international mindedness and leadership. So,
Shamiela, that's wonderful, but we do have to give other people a chance to speak. I'm going to go next to Peter. So, Peter, what would you say? I mean, obviously, we've heard lots of things that you'd already said, but if you were to highlight a few points, what would you say?
We try to operate with the concept of diaspora and talk with young people about diaspora throughout history and how to position themselves within to be intentional about understanding their location within diaspora, whether they are Hmong or Oromo, to give them a grounding in the history of other immigrants who have had an impact on the future of the country that they left because of their access to resources and solidarities within the United States. So diaspora has been a really important concept for us. I want to encourage you, if you have the time and interest, to look at the YouTube video of the presentation a week ago that a young Hmong poet, My Nang Vang, presented about the ways that she is sort of crafting a new language. Hmong people came to the United States without a written language. They came from different regions in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and originally in China. And so there were different dialects. And here within the diaspora in the United States, after 30 odd years, a new version of the language Hmong is emerging, syncretic from these different specific groups within the community. And this young woman who is a poet and is actually on the verge of a PhD in education policy at the University of Wisconsin. But through her poetry, she is trying to test out a new version of her language and makes a wonderful case for it in her presentation. So that's My Nang Vang in our videos. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That's wonderful. That's a really good recommendation to see that video. Would you mind just putting in the chat the title of that video? Because I think that would help people to find it on YouTube. Thank you very much indeed.
Sure.
I'm now going to ask Shonagh and then Molly, and then I'll be handing it to Anne to close the conference. So, Shonagh.
Thanks, Helen. I think that's a really interesting question to reflect on. And my thoughts in terms of what have I done to promote international mindedness has been very much about looking at things from different perspectives. And I think that's something that I tried to convey in the workshop that I did earlier on. So an example that came to my attention recently was I'm a governor at a primary school in Nottingham, and they were talking about raising money for Ukraine. And the children were very keen to raise some money for Ukraine. And I just posed to them, you know, what did the school do to raise money for Afghanistan? What did the school do to raise money for Syria? And of course, the answer came back, nothing. And I try not to sit in judgment about that because people don't know what they don't know. So I just sort of said, you know, the presentation of how those situations are being delivered to us is very different. You know, the Ukrainian refugees are blonde and blue-eyed, and these refugees are not those things. They're often Muslim, they have brown skin, and it's interesting that we aren't responding the same way. And it gave pause for thought around the table. It gave them an opportunity to just reflect on how they view different issues. We continued with the conversation, and this particular school has got 35 different home languages. And on the notice board in the school, they have pictures of the children, and they say next to them their flag from their country of origin and the language that they speak. And a parent came in and asked the school to take the picture of her child down. And it was because she's Russian and she didn't want any stigma or any negativity directed at her child who was Russian. And it gave me pause for thought that actually we've got a situation here where we need to look at situations from a wide range of perspectives that, yes, of course, I might have, because of my origins, a perspective on how the wars in different parts of the world are communicated to us in the West. And I might have a perspective on how the support that we as a nation have given Ukraine that we have not given elsewhere. But we also have to think about, actually, there are other people involved in this. And there's a little girl who doesn't feel safe coming to school because she's Russian. And that's a problem. So what I would say is always have an intersectional approach, looking at things from as many different perspectives as you can possibly think of. And where you have diversity, you are able to have challenge. So someone's able to challenge me, who's there on my soapbox talking about, you know, the press and how they've presented different wars, being challenged in a really positive way. So where we can try and take challenge and listen to learn, I think that is the best way we can be internationally minded.
Thank you very much, Shonagh. Those are excellent points. Thank you. And I'm going to ask Molly, and then when I hand over to Anne, I'll ask Anne for any concluding points for the panel, and also be asking Anne to close the conference as well. So, Molly, anything else that you'd like to add about international mindedness?
For me, again, in my little circle, in my little corner, so part of what I do when I train, sometimes I train literacy coaches, and at times I go to the schools directly to work with the teachers. So we do little activities, especially around phonics, so that they begin to really understand what we mean by phonemic awareness and phonetics, right? And so, because the science of reading is actually new to all of us, you know, some of the trusted ways that we were teaching reading haven't really been working out all that well. So now there's an emphasis on phonics, right? So I will make them write a sentence, and it's words they've never heard before, words they've never seen before, a language they've never spoken. I have Swahili and Japanese as my tiny little other languages. Then they'll be able to write that down. Then I ask them, how were you able to write that down? Is this a language you speak? No. What language is it? I'm like, it's Japanese. They're like, what? I just wrote Japanese. I'm like, yeah, you just did. How did you do that? And they're like, no, we just listened to what you were saying and you're able to write it down. I'm like, you see, so you have mastered phonics. It's about the sounds and the letters. It doesn't matter that it's a language you don't speak nor understand, right? And then I'll write a sentence maybe in Swahili and I'll make them read it. And they're able to decode it correctly and read it, but they don't know what it means and they don't even know what they're saying. I'm like, oh, you guys just spoke beautiful Swahili. They're like, what does it mean? I'm like, you just said you are beautiful. And then they're like, oh, I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that. And then they start using that because it just sounds cool. And they're like, actually, it's kind of similar to our language. It's kind of similar. Oh, it sounds like one other language. I'm like, actually, Swahili is a really cool language to learn. And then I'll do the same exercise, but now not using the Roman alphabet for the Japanese. I'll write it in hiragana or katakana. I can't write in kanji, but the other two, right? And then I'll ask them what that is, and they're clueless. They're like, we don't know what this is. What are these sticks? Then I make them realize that the same thing you read earlier, or the same thing you were able to write earlier is this, but it's in a different writing system. So this means what you have also mastered, not just phonics and the letters that represent them, is that the letters that represent them are particularly from a specific alphabet system. It's the Roman alphabet. This is one of the Japanese ones that you don't know. Oh, okay. So other countries have a writing system? Yes. But when you use the same writing system, but with different, same sounds but different meaning and putting them together, then they sort of realize. So it's just that. And they start chatting to me about like, how come you know all these languages? So like, it's because I take travel and I'm curious about other people and places. And then they're, isn't it expensive? And I'm like, no, you can do it too. And these are teams in rural South Africa. And I'm like, do it. You can even volunteer. Because, I picked up Swahili in Kenya when I was volunteering. I'm like, during the school holidays, what are you doing? Not much. We're kind of on holiday. I'm like, go volunteer in other places on the continent and have you a free holiday, but a meaningful one. So yeah, that's kind of what I do. Molly.
That's wonderful, really fascinating. And I love the way you just say really modestly, all my other languages are Japanese and Swahili. I'm like, Awesome, Molly. Thank you so much. So I just would like now to thank the panel. Every member of the panel has contributed so much, and we've had so many diverse views and opinions from Peter, Shonagh, Shamiela and Molly. Thank you very, very much indeed. We've all benefited from your insights today. Thank you. And before I hand over to Anne, I would just like to thank her hugely, because Anne has been the driving force behind this conference, and she's been the person who's got it all together and made it happen. So absolutely fantastic, Anne. And now I hand over to Anne Beatty to close the conference. Anne.
Thank you, everybody, for today. I'm completely blown away by everybody's contribution. I feel it's been amazing for me. I've learnt so much, and I hope all of you have learnt many interesting things too. And thank you, Helen, and everybody for thanking me, but I've got some very special thanks to give to everybody. I want to thank our very generous speakers today, and all the workshop hosts and all of the UNESCO ASPnet schools and coordinators who shared what I hope you will find inspirational work at this conference today. We will be sharing the work maybe in a week or so once we've got ourselves together. But I really have to give special thanks to Mike and Lucy Fleetham, who have been instrumental in sorting out the technical stuff, doing the slides, keeping us all on track. The Steve Sinnott Foundation for sponsoring the work. And the team behind the scenes, Helen, Sophia, Liz, Shamiela, who, have been talking about this and putting this conference together for some months. It's taken quite a lot of work. And our two sponsors, Contemplative Photography, which you'll see the links to, and STEM Unity, who have been sponsoring us. So that's all from me. Thank you, everyone, for making today such a special day.